This is the year country music hit its commercial peak. It is also the year the genre split in two, and nobody noticed until it was already over. Shania Twain was at the center of it. Welcome to the class of 1995. The first crack came on February 7th. On that Tuesday, a virtually unknown Canadian singer named Shania Twain released her second studio album, The Woman in Me. Her debut record had failed 2 years earlier. Mercury Nashville had no major promotional push planned for the follow-up. By the end of the year, the album would sell 4 million copies in the United States alone, making it 1995's best-selling country record. Within 5 years, it would sell 12 million copies. The reason had nothing to do with country music tradition. The producer on The Woman in Me was Robert John Lange, a South African rock producer known to his friends as Mutt. Lange had built his career engineering hard rock, including AC/DC's Back in Black, Def Leppard's Hysteria, and Foreigner's 4. He had no Nashville pedigree, and no interest in honky-tonk authenticity. It is worth pausing on what that authenticity meant. For 30 years, the sound of Nashville had been shaped by men like Chet Atkins and Owen Bradley, the architects of the Nashville sound, who had built their legacy at RCA Studio B on Music Row and in Bradley's Quonset Hut studio just blocks away. Their crossover instinct had always been to smooth the rough edges of country music while keeping its emotional core intact. Mutt Lange's instinct was different. He wanted to replace the core entirely. The two had met at the Country Music Association fanfare in June 1993, and they had married 6 months later, on December 28th. By February 1995, the husband and wife team had finished an album that sounded nothing like the records Garth Brooks and Alan Jackson had been making for the previous 5 years. Country radio played it anyway. 4 singles from The Woman in Me hit number 1. Those singles were Any Man of Mine, If You're Not in It for Love, I'm Outta Here, You Win My Love, and No One Needs to Know. Twain did not tour the album, and she had no road show. What she had instead was MTV-ready music videos, a sexier visual presentation than any female country artist had previously attempted, and a husband producer who treated country radio like a marketing channel. By March of the following year, The Woman in Me would pass Patsy Cline's Greatest Hits to become the best-selling album by a female country artist in history. This was not the first time Nashville had faced this exact argument. In 1980, the urban cowboy film had briefly fused country music with mainstream pop culture, flooding the format with crossover artists and nearly fracturing the genre's identity before the traditionalist backlash of the early 80s restored the balance. 1995 felt familiar, except this time the crossover was not a movie. It was a production philosophy, and it was winning. While Twain was rewriting the commercial rules from one direction, the traditionalists were pushing back from the other. In June 1995, Alan Jackson released Who I Am, an unapologetically traditional honky-tonk record that debuted at number 1 on the country chart and number 5 on the Billboard 200. The album sold more than 100,000 copies in its first week and was eventually certified double platinum. Jackson was 36 years old, wore a Stetson, and made no concession to crossover. He was a Grand Ole Opry member, and he played like he knew it, every steel guitar note a thesis statement. His record was a thesis statement: country music does not need to sound like a Def Leppard B-side to succeed. Then, on November 21st, Garth Brooks released Fresh Horses. The album sold 1.08 million copies in its first week, the largest debut week in country music history up to that point. By the following year, Brooks would be the second best-selling artist in American music history. He was 33 years old, and he had achieved what no country act had ever achieved before: total commercial dominance of mainstream music. The boom was undeniable. 24 country albums went gold in 1995, and 21 went platinum. The Recording Industry Association of America, RIAA, had created an entirely new certification called Diamond for 10 million units sold, partly to accommodate the scale of what Garth Brooks and Shania Twain were doing. The middle layer of the boom was filling out too. In August, Faith Hill released her second album, It Matters to Me, which would eventually go 4 times platinum. A month later, Tim McGraw released his third album, All I Want, on Arista Nashville, which debuted at #1 on the country chart and entered the Billboard 200 at #4. McGraw was building the foundation for a touring partnership with Hill that would begin the following year, end in marriage, and produce the highest-grossing country tour in history. That same month, Brooks and Dunn released Waitin' on Sundown, their third consecutive #1 country album. 2 months earlier, in June, an unknown 27-year-old named Kenny Chesney had released his second album, All I Need to Know, on BNA Records. The album produced top 10 singles. Chesney would not become a stadium headliner for another decade, but the seed was planted in 1995. This is where the split that nobody could see began to form. On the surface, country music had never been healthier. SoundScan data had been tracking the industry since May of 1991, and the numbers were extraordinary. Country had been chronically undercounted for decades, and the genre's actual audience was nearly 70% larger among young listeners than it had been 5 years earlier. Arbitron's 1990 demographic research had already shown that 40% of country fans fit into the most affluent advertising clusters in America, compared to fewer than a quarter of the general population. Madison Avenue understood what Nashville had taken a generation to figure out. Country fans had money, and they'd spend it on whatever the radio told them to buy. But underneath the sales figures, a different story was unfolding. Shania Twain had proven that an artist could top the country charts without ever performing in a country setting, without a steel guitar in the mix, and without writing in the Nashville songwriter tradition. The Mutt Lange production sound was rock music with a fiddle overdub. Her video aesthetic was MTV, and her marketing was pop. And the audience was buying it faster than they'd ever bought anything else. Alan Jackson, George Strait, and Brooks and Dunn were still selling records. They were still topping charts. But by 1995, they were also becoming the older guard without realizing it. They had come up through the class of 1989, that generational wave that had brought Brooks, Clint Black, and Travis Tritt to the mainstream on the back of traditional honky-tonk credibility. The traditional sound that had defined that entire boom, the sound that built Garth Brooks' empire, was being quietly replaced by something the industry was not yet calling pop country, because there was no language for it yet. By 1997, when Twain released Come On Over, the pop country sound would not be a curiosity. It would be the industry. Come On Over would sell 40 million copies worldwide. The Mutt Lange production template would become the template, the MTV Ready video the new standard. And the artists who had refused to cross over in 1995 would find themselves by 1998 talking about a Nashville they no longer recognized. A music row that had quietly rerouted itself away from RCA Studio B and everything Chet Atkins had built there. The cracks had started in February. Nobody saw them because everyone was too busy watching Garth Brooks break his own records. That's what makes 1995 the most consequential year in modern country music. Not because it was the peak, not because it was the crack, because it was both, at the same time, in the same year, played out across a single 12-month stretch from one wedding in December 1993 to $1 billion follow-up 2 years later. The class of 1995 didn't just take over country music, it quietly replaced it.